Chapter 1, The Last Sound They Ever Made. There is a photograph. It was taken in the autumn of 1971, somewhere in the highland corridor north of Arusha in the United Republic of Tanzania. The photograph is black and white, slightly overexposed along its upper right corner, as though the camera had flinched. In it, 14 children stand in a loose formation outside a cluster of mud brick dwellings. They are not looking at the camera, not one of them. They are all looking at something to the left of the frame, something the photographer either could not see or chose not to include. Their mouths are closed. Their hands hang at their sides. And if you look closely, if you bring the image near enough to your face that the grain of the paper begins to blur, you will notice that each child's fingers are bent in the same configuration. All 14 of them, the same curl of the index finger, the same press of the thumb against the middle knuckle, identical, as though rehearsed, as though commanded. The photograph was found in a manila envelope inside a water-damaged filing cabinet at the offices of the East African Medical Auxiliary Bureau in Dar es Salaam in the year 2003. The cabinet had been in storage since 1978. The envelope bore no label, no name, no case number, only a single word written in pencil on the back of the photograph itself, in handwriting that did not match any signature found elsewhere in the archive. The word was listening. Before we examine what was found, we must first understand what was lost. The village of Mngordo sat at an elevation of roughly 2,100 meters above sea level, cradled between two ridges of volcanic rock that the local Meru people had named in their own tongue the shoulders of the old woman. It was not a large settlement, perhaps 40 families at its height, subsisting on smallholder agriculture, the grazing of cattle, and the slow rhythms of a world that had not changed substantially in 3 generations. There was no electricity in the village in 1971. There was no paved road within 11 kilometers. The nearest structure of colonial administrative significance was a district health post staffed by a single nurse practitioner, a man named Bernardo Say, who had trained in Nairobi and arrived at the post in January of 1970, and who would later file the only official account of what transpired in Mngordo between the months of August and November of that year. Jose's account, 4 pages of typewritten text on carbon paper, was not filed until March of 1972. The delay, he noted in his opening paragraph, was due to his uncertainty about what to call what he had witnessed. He wrote, and these are his precise words as they appear in the carbon copy that survived, "I have waited these many months to submit this report because I am a man of science and I did not wish to write something that would cause my superiors to question my fitness for continued service. But the children are not speaking, and they have not spoken for 112 days, and I no longer know what I am looking at." 112 days of silence from 14 children who, by every account of every adult in Mngordo, had spoken normally, laughed normally, cried normally, argued and sang and called for their mothers in the night, right up until the morning of the 14th of August 1971. And then, between the rising of the sun and the hour at which the women returned from the lower field, the children stopped. Chapter 2, what the elders remembered the first to notice was a woman named Zawadi. She was the mother of 2 of the children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, and she had left them that morning in the care of the village's eldest woman, a figure the community referred to only as Bibi Mkubwa, which translates approximately as the great-grandmother. Bibi Mkubwa was not, by any formal reckoning, related to the majority of the children she watched over. She was simply old enough, and still enough, and the village had organized itself around her quietude the way water organizes itself around stone. Zawadi returned from the field at approximately the 3rd hour past midday. The sun had already begun its westward lean, throwing long shadows off the volcanic ridge to the east, and the air carried the smell of dry grass and the faint mineral tang that always preceded the highland winds. She found the children gathered in the space between the 3 central dwellings, not playing, not sleeping, simply standing arranged in a loose cluster, faces turned upward at an angle that she could not immediately explain, as though they were watching something descend from above. She called to her son by name. He did not turn. She called again, louder, and crossed the distance between them at a pace that she later described to Nurse Osei as the walk of a woman who already knows something is wrong, but has not yet given herself permission to run. She touched her son's shoulder. He turned to look at her then. His eyes were clear. He was not feverish. He did not appear frightened. He simply looked at her with an expression she struggled to name, settling finally on the word she used in her own language, a word that Osei translated into his report as the look of someone who has just remembered something very important and is deciding whether to tell you. And then he raised his right hand, bent his index finger, pressed his thumb against his middle knuckle, and held the configuration steady. Zawadi did not understand what it meant. She asked him aloud what he was doing. He did not answer. He did not look away. He simply held the gesture, patient and still as the volcanic rock above them. She tried to take his hand. He allowed it, but when she released it, the fingers returned to the same position. By nightfall, it was clear that all 14 children were the same. The parents met that night in the dwelling of the village headman, a man named Elias Mrema, and the account of that meeting comes to us through two sources: a handwritten letter that Mrema later sent to a cousin in Moshi, and a separate oral account collected in 1989 by an anthropology student from the University of Nairobi, whose field notes were donated to the university library after her death in a road accident in 1994. The field notes reference the letter, which the student had apparently been allowed to read but not to copy. The letter itself has not been located. What both sources agree upon is this: the children were not deaf. They responded to loud sounds, to sudden movements, to the approach of unfamiliar animals. They tracked movement with their eyes and showed every indication of full sensory awareness. They simply did not speak, and they did not cry, and they did not laugh. Whatever sound they had once made, they no longer made it, and no adult in no Gordo, no matter how long they sat with their children, or how gently they coaxed, or how desperately they pleaded, could draw a single syllable from any of them. What the letter apparently added, and what the field notes excerpt in partial quotation, was Mrema's description of the second phenomenon, the one that would not become widely known outside the village until Nurse Osei's report surfaced decades later. The symbols. Chapter 3, the marks they left behind. No one saw the first symbol drawn. That is important. In a village of 40 families, in a settlement where the walls of the communal dwellings were visible from nearly every point of the central gathering space, no adult witnessed the act of drawing. The symbols simply appeared. 3 of them on the exterior eastern wall of Bibi Makubwa's dwelling, sometime in the night between the 15th and 16th of August. By the end of the first week, there were 9 symbols distributed across 5 separate structures. By the end of the second week, there were 31. Nurse Osei, who arrived in Gordo for the first time on the 29th of August, described the symbols in his report with considerable care. He was not an artist, he noted, and he apologized for the quality of his reproductions, but he attempted to sketch each distinct symbol in the margins of his carbon paper. Those sketches, faint and smudged by the decades, survived in the Dar es Salaam archive alongside the text of the report. There were, in total, 7 distinct symbol forms. Each one appeared multiple times across the village walls, always rendered in what appeared to be a mixture of ash and animal fat applied with a fingertip. Always the same size, always the same pressure, as though drawn by the same hand. They had not been drawn by the same hand. Osei confirmed this through a method as simple as it was disturbing. He watched. He spent 3 days in Gordo on his first visit, sleeping on a mat in the headman's dwelling, waking before dawn to observe the children as they moved through their silent routines. On the morning of his third day, just before the sky began to lighten in the east, he saw a girl of 8, a child he identified in his report only by the initial K, rise from her sleeping place, cross to the outer wall of the nearest dwelling, and draw. She used the index finger of her right hand. She did not pause. She did not look at the wall first, did not trace the outline tentatively or correct her marks. She drew the symbol in a single, continuous, unhesitating motion, as though she were not creating the shape but simply revealing one that had always been there beneath the plaster. Then she returned to her sleeping place and lay down. Osei wrote, "I have been a medical practitioner for 11 years. I have seen children in fever, in trauma, in the early stages of neurological deterioration. What I watched this morning resembled none of those things. The child moved with purpose. She knew what she was drawing, and when she had drawn it, she was satisfied. I could see the satisfaction in her posture when she lay back down. The way you look when you have completed a necessary task." The symbols were eventually photographed by a Colonial administrative officer who passed through the district in October of 1971. His name was Gerald Hartwell, a British civil servant of the waning colonial apparatus who was technically no longer employed by any governing authority in Tanzania following independence in 1961, but who had remained in the region in an advisory capacity that no one had formally terminated and no one had formally continued. Hartwell took 12 photographs of the village walls using a 35mm camera. He forwarded these photographs along with a brief accompanying note to the East African Medical Auxiliary Bureau in Dar es Salaam. His note read, in full, passing through Ngordodo District, 4th of October. 14 children in apparent selective mutism, cause unattributed. Wall markings of uncertain origin. Children in adequate physical health. Recommend psychiatric evaluation if resources permit. No further action taken by this office. The photographs arrived in Dar es Salaam. They were filed. The file was assigned a case number. The case number, when cross-referenced with the Bureau's own intake ledger, leads to a gap. The ledger shows an entry for the date of receipt, the 4th of October 1971, and a second entry dated the 9th of October that reads simply, "Transferred per directive, London." The photographs in the manila envelope found in 2003 were copies. Osei's carbon report was a copy. The originals had been sent to London in October of 1971, and whatever London did with them, if London did anything at all, has not been established. What remained in Dar es Salaam was enough to ask questions, not enough to answer them. Chapter 4, the language that was not a language. By the end of September, the children had developed something that the adults of Ngordodo began calling among themselves the talking with hands. This is Osei's translation of the Swahili phrase the villagers used. It is an imprecise translation because the Swahili phrase carries a connotation not fully rendered in English, a sense that the talking was not merely done with the hands, but that the hands were the talking, that the gesture and the meaning were the same thing rather than one standing in for the other. The system, if it was a system, consisted of approximately 40 distinct gestures, each involving specific configurations of the fingers, specific movements of the wrist, specific positions of the hands relative to the body. Osei documented 22 of them across his 3 visits to the village. He attempted to identify correspondences between the gestures and any known sign language. He consulted through correspondence a colleague in Nairobi who had experience working with deaf communities in the Rift Valley region. The colleague's response, which Osei quoted in his report, stated, "The configurations you describe do not correspond to any gesture system I have encountered or read of in the literature available to me." Several of the individual hand shapes bear superficial resemblance to elements of various signing systems, but the combinations and the grammar, if there is a grammar, are not recognizable to me. I would be very interested to observe the children directly if an arrangement could be made. No arrangement was made. Osei does not record why. What he does record in the final section of his third visit notes is what he observed when two of the children communicated with one another in the gesture system for the first time in his presence. He had been watching them for perhaps an hour, seated at a distance he judged non-intrusive, when the boy of 9, Zawadi's son, turned to the girl of 7, his sister, and began to gesture. The exchange lasted, by Osei's estimate, approximately 4 minutes. Then the boy stopped. The girl responded with 3 gestures. The boy nodded once and turned away. Osei wrote, "I have watched human beings communicate in many languages and in many circumstances. I know what it looks like when meaning passes between two people. It looked like that. Whatever they said to each other, they understood each other." And for one moment, in the middle of the exchange, the boy paused and looked at me. Just briefly. And the expression on his face was not unfriendly, it was something closer to patience, as though he knew I did not understand yet, as though he expected that someday I might. There is one more detail in Osei's report that resists every framework available to a rational mind. The gestures were not taught. Osei confirmed this through direct questioning of every adult in Ngordo across his 3 visits. He asked each parent, each elder, each adult member of the community individually and without the others present, had they taught the children any gesture system? Had anyone, any visitor, any teacher, any passing traveler demonstrated these hand configurations to the children? Had the children been exposed to any individual or community that communicated without speech? Every adult said no. Osei believed them, not because adults cannot lie, but because the nature of the lie that would have been required was too elaborate and too consistent across too many independent witnesses to sustain. The children had learned nothing. The children had simply begun, and there was the final observation offered not by Osei but by Bibi Mikubwa herself in a conversation that Osei recorded with her permission on his 3rd visit, his last visit to Ngordo before he filed his report and, as the archive indicates, before he requested a transfer to a post in coastal Lamu that was granted without comment in April of 1972. Bibi Mikubwa said through Osei's translation that the children had not changed since the 14th of August, that they ate the same, slept the same, grew the same, but that they were no longer listening to things inside the village. Osei asked her what she meant. She said they are listening to something outside, something that is still speaking to them. We cannot hear it, but they can. And she paused and she looked past Osei's shoulder at the ridge of volcanic rock to the east, and she said, "I think they have been listening to it for a very long time. I think perhaps we all were once, a long time ago, before we forgot how." Chapter 5. What London received the sealed transfer to London in October of 1971 passed through the administrative machinery of the residual British colonial health infrastructure, a bureaucratic organism that had technically ceased to exist with Tanzanian independence, but which maintained, as such organisms often do, a quiet and persisting afterlife in the form of shared office space, forwarding addresses, and the institutional inertia of filing systems that no one had formally ordered closed. The receiving office, as best as can be reconstructed from the surviving paper trail, was a subdivision of the Commonwealth Medical Research Liaison, located at the time in a building on Millbank, London, adjacent to the river. The building no longer stands. It was demolished in 1983 as part of a riverside development project. The records it housed were, according to the development company's decommissioning documentation, transferred to a Ministry of Health repository in Kew. A request submitted to the Kew repository in 2004, citing the Ngordo case number from the Dar es Salaam ledger, returned a response confirming that no record matching that case number existed in the repository's catalog. This is not necessarily evidence of concealment. Records are lost. Filing systems are imperfect. The bureaucratic inheritance of empire is a vast and largely unsorted sediment of paper, and things sink into it and are not recovered. This is the charitable interpretation, and it may well be the correct one. But there is a secondary document that complicates the charity. In the archive of a retired British civil servant named Thomas Aldcroft, donated to the London Metropolitan Archives following his death in 1998, there is a single page of handwritten notes dated the 12th of November 1971. Aldcroft had served in East Africa in the 1950s and maintained correspondence with former colleagues there well into the 1970s. The notes appear to be a summary of a telephone conversation. They are brief. They read in their entirety in Ngordo Kuri, 14 children. Symbols confirm non-local origin, no developmental precedent in literature. Photographs referred upward, no further contact expected from field. Recommend quiet file. Quiet file. The phrase appears nowhere else in the archive. It has no administrative definition in any Commonwealth Medical Research Liaison documentation that has been made publicly available. But the meaning it implies, a file that is stored in silence and is not to be retrieved, a file that is given a home precisely so that it will not be found, is not difficult to intuit. Gerald Hartwell, the administrative officer who had photographed the village walls and written a brief accompanying note, died in Arusha in March of 1973, approximately 16 months after his visit to Ngordodo. The cause of death recorded on his death certificate was cardiac failure. He was 51 years old. He had no documented history of heart disease. His personal effects were collected by a younger colleague and shipped to a sister in Dorset, England. The sister, who outlived her brother by many decades and died in 2009, at no point made reference to any papers or photographs related to Tanzania in the inventory of his estate that passed through her hands. Either there were none or she did not know what she was looking at. Bernard Osei, the nurse practitioner, retired from medical service in 1988 and returned to his family's region in western Kenya. He was contacted in 2005 by a researcher who had located his archived report in Dar es Salaam. He agreed to a single written correspondence. In response to questions about the children of Ngordo, he wrote one paragraph. It read, "I have spent more than 30 years trying to find a name for what I witnessed. I have read widely. I have spoken to colleagues when I could find the courage to raise the subject without appearing unwell. I have found nothing that fits. I will tell you only this: the symbols on the walls were the same on the last day I visited as they were on the first day I saw them. No new ones had been added. No old ones had faded. They looked, every time I saw them, as though they had been drawn that morning." He did not respond to further correspondence. Chapter 6, What the Children Became. The silence ended partially in the spring of 1972. The field notes of the Nairobi anthropology student, incomplete and secondhand as they are, contain one passage sourced from her conversations with villagers during her field work in 1989. By that time, 18 years had passed. Several of the original children were adults. Most had remained in the region. 2 had died, one in a farming accident, one in childbirth. Of the 12 who were living and traceable, the student managed to speak through intermediaries with 4. None of them would discuss the period of silence directly. The student noted that this refusal was not hostile. It was, she wrote, the refusal of someone who has been asked to explain a color to a person who has never seen, not unwillingness, incapacity. What they did confirm through the intermediaries was that the silence had not ended completely. that they still heard when certain conditions of light and wind and quiet aligned, something at the upper edge of perception, something that was not sound exactly or not only sound, and that the gestures, the configurations of the hand that had characterized their silent months still came to them sometimes, unbidden in the space between sleep and waking. One of the four, a woman who had been 7 years old in 1971 and who was by 1989 a mother of 3 children of her own, said through the intermediary that she had once, in a moment of absent thought, made one of the old gestures while her eldest daughter was watching. The daughter, who was 4 years old and had never been taught anything of the kind, looked at the gesture and then looked at her mother and smiled, and said in a small, clear voice, as though completing a sentence her mother had begun, "Yes." The student wrote, "I do not know what to do with this information. I am recording it because I believe my obligation is to record. But I want to be transparent with my methodology notes. When the intermediary translated this account to me and I wrote it down, I was sitting in the afternoon light outside a building in Arusha, and my hand, the hand holding the pen, made a shape I did not intend. A curl of the index finger, a press of the thumb. I noticed it only because the intermediary saw it and stopped speaking, and looked at my hand, and did not say anything for a long time." The symbols on the walls of Ngordo were last documented in a series of photographs taken by a French geographical survey team in 2001, 30 years after they first appeared. The survey team was mapping the geological features of the volcanic ridge and passed through the village as part of their transit route. The photographs were not taken for any purpose related to the symbols. They appear incidentally in the background of images captured for entirely other reasons, pressed against the old mud plaster of dwellings that were still standing and still inhabited. The symbols are visible in 3 of the photographs. They are unweathered in 30 years of highland sun and highland rain, of the slow abrasion of volcanic dust carried on the highland winds. They have not faded, they have not cracked. They sit in the plaster as though they were laid down yesterday, or as though they were always there, deeper than the plaster, deeper than the mud brick beneath it, down in the volcanic rock itself, waiting only for someone to clear away the surface and reveal them. The survey team did not note the symbols in their published documentation. When contacted in 2004 by the same researcher who had written to Osei, one of the team's members replied that she had noticed the markings at the time and had found them unusual but had assumed they were decorative. When asked if she could describe them in any detail, she said she could not. She said she had tried to remember them several times since receiving the researcher's inquiry, and that each time she attempted to reconstruct them in her mind, the shapes dissolved before she could hold them. She said it is like trying to remember a word in a language you have never learned. You know there is a word, you know it means something specific, but the shape of it will not stay. Chapter 7, the archive closes. There is one final document in what has been assembled here, and it is the strangest of all, which is a considerable distinction given the company it keeps. In 2003, the same year, the manila envelope was discovered in the water-damaged filing cabinet in Dar es Salaam. A short typed letter arrived at the offices of a small academic journal of ethnographic studies in Edinburgh, Scotland. The letter was submitted as a reader correspondence. It was not published because the journal's editorial board could not verify the identity of the sender. The sender gave a name that, when searched against academic registries, medical licensing boards, and public records in 4 countries, produced no result. The letter bore a postmark from Nairobi, Kenya, dated the 3rd of September 2003. The letter read in part, "I am writing regarding a case your readers may not be aware of concerning 14 children in northern Tanzania in 1971. I was present in the region during the period in question. I am not able to say more about my identity or my role. I am writing because I believe the record should include one detail that does not appear in any document I am aware of, though I understand that documents exist which I have not seen. The detail is this: on the morning of the 14th of August 1971, before the women returned from the field, before any adult in the village noticed that the children had gone quiet, there was a sound. I was on the ridge above the village at the time. I was there for reasons unrelated to the village. The sound lasted approximately 40 seconds. It came from no single direction. It was not loud. It was not painful. It was not frightening in the way that an alarm is frightening. It was frightening in the way that recognition is frightening when you encounter something familiar in a context where it cannot possibly be familiar. I am a person with considerable experience in acoustic phenomena, and I have no classification for what I heard that morning. I have spent 32 years attempting to find one. I am, I think, running out of time in which to look. The letter ended there. No signature, no return address beyond the postmark. The journal did not publish it. The original was retained in the journal's correspondence files, where it was located in 2008 by a postgraduate student conducting an unrelated archival search. She made a photocopy. The photocopy is the only surviving version. The original, when the journal's offices were relocated in 2006, was not transferred with the other files. It was not found in the old offices when they were subsequently occupied by a law firm. Where it went is not known. What remains then is a manila envelope in a damaged cabinet, 4 pages of carbon paper, a letter with no author, photographs in which the symbols will not stay in memory, a gesture made by a woman that her 4-year-old daughter completed without being taught, a sound on a ridge above a village that a careful person spent 32 years trying to name, and 14 children who stopped speaking on a morning in August of 1971, who drew the same symbols without instruction, who communicated in a language that no linguist recognized, and who, when they grew into adults and bore children of their own, passed something on, not intentionally, not through teaching. The way certain things are passed on, the way a shape in the blood carries forward through generations without ever being spoken aloud, without ever being named, because the name for it is not in any language that mouths were designed to form. The file on Ngordo, if such a file exists in London or elsewhere, is quiet, but silence is not the same as absence. The symbols on the walls of Ngordo do not fade, and somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, in the body of every person whose blood traces back to those 14 children, a hand moves in the dark, the index finger curls, the thumb presses against the middle knuckle, and holds patient, still, listening.